So hello everybody and welcome back to the final session of this year's conference. So we've looked in quite a bit of detail over the recent or over the previous sessions at specific bands and looked at kind of situation in those bands. We're now going to switch and look a bit more broadly to the evolving shape of the spectrum landscape more widely, really, and looking at bringing the required spectrum to market, looking at the timing of bringing spectrum to market, looking at the importance of planning ahead, and developing a culture of certainty, I suppose, for the different industry stakeholders as well. So we have an excellent panel of speakers here to discuss this, both from the regulatory side and also from industry. So to introduce them and to introduce the session more broadly, I'd like to now welcome to the stage someone who I'm sure needs a very little introduction himself, Jean-Jacques Massima from ITU. Jean-Jacques, great to have you with us, and yeah, really looking forward to this final session. So I'll pass over to you.
Thank you very much, Dan. I am pleased, yes, to announce that the last session has a very well-balanced panel with two regulators, one policymaker, and an associative way with GSMA and ITU with international organizations. So you will be more than happy, I hope, to see the Minister of Burkina Faso. We are sorry, but Ms. Adja Fatimata Ouattara has some mandatory duties on last minute, and she will be replaced in our panel by Mr. Galiam Ouedraogo, who is the Director General of Infrastructure at the Ministry. With this recall, I think Dan has already given to you, yes, the main scope of this last session, which is, in fact, yes, the wide view of the spectrum landscape in Africa, but also market considerations of this spectrum. And we will hear three presentations coming from GSMA, from Uganda, and from South Africa. And then we'll have some questions to the panelists and questions from the room also, from the chat. And we'll discuss a bit and then launch the debate. With that, yes, we will no more lose time. I will ask to come with the first presentation, if you are ready there. And after those presentations, we are already answering some of the questions were in the debate discussions. So we'll fine-tune those questions after these excellent presentations. So maybe we can start by what was the first in the studio. What was the first presentation ready for the studio? Is it GSMA?
I think we got Galiam coming up first, Jean-Jacques. So Galiam's going to be speaking first of all.
So we have...
we seem to have some issues there. Let me... Oh, Jean-Jacques back. Go on, Jean-Jacques. Sorry, I think we lost you for a second.
Yes. We'll give GSM...
We'll try and sort out the Jean-Jacques connectivity issues there now. So, but let me first welcome to give his introductory remarks, Galiam Ouedraogo from Burkina Faso is going to be giving a perspective from what's happening in the country there. So Galiam, I'm really looking forward to that. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Thank you, Jean-Jacques. Good afternoon to everybody. It's a real pleasure to get the opportunity to see all of you again. Since few years, I'm no more too close of this fantastic world of spectrum management. And today, on behalf of Madam Adja Fatimata Ouattara Sano, Ministry of ICT of Burkina Faso, I have the great honor to share the view of Madam Ministry related to this session 9. First of all, the main topic of this conference address a fundamental question for the future of ICT in Africa, making spectrum work for Africa. This is very important because we know that we cannot cover Africa with fiber optical. We cannot manage all the infrastructure issue without taking in consideration the spectrum, especially when we want to address digital divide issue And for this reason, the first element of contribution of Madam Ministry is to make congratulations for the choice of the thematic of this conference. This session related to spectrum efficiency usage is a key element to achieve a goal of broadband connectivity for all and reducing digital divide issue. The contribution of these small introductory remarks will be done in 2 steps. Firstly, I will speak about the issue, the situation, the analysis of the situation of spectrum usage. And secondly, I will share some first guidance before all the debates. The first element is to say that there is different situation. This is the first element to know. Depending of the countries, the realities in Burkina Faso, South Africa, and other countries are not the same. Depending of rural or urban areas, and depending of nature of the radio service that is used, the usage of mobile services and the usage of fixed services, for example, for ISPs are different. And there is also a key issue related to the usage of available spectrum. You know that in Africa and on many countries also, for the spectrum below 6 gigs, for example, dedicated to the mobile service, more than 30% of the available spectrum are not used. For the fixed services, we have spectrum hoarding. You know that on many countries, fixed services was provided, allocated for the first come to first serve. And most of the users, some of them, keeping the spectrum and don't use it efficiently. And this is a big issue. There is also the issue of neutral technology. And one of the issues that we can notice for the spectrum efficiency questions is the lack of information on the real use of spectrum. This is a big issue. Many regulatories have tools, but even when it's the case, it's not specifically well noticed. And last but not least is the regulation, the rigid regulation framework that is present on most of our countries. In terms of guidance, when we see all those issues related to spectrum efficiency usage, I think that the first element, we need to have a precise and dynamic knowledge of spectrum assignment all over our countries. This is the first point. The second point is to include in regulatory and all the possible regulatory elements, the spectrum hoarding criteria, especially in the fixed radio service licenses usage. This is very important. And the third element for me, this is very important, specifically for mobile service, is that the first come, first serve can be the good solution when there is a lot of spectrum and not many usage. Auction is the trends today that we see in many countries, but on my view is that there's no specific solution. We should always have an adapted solution to the reality of the country. And the main point is that we should be pragmatic and adaptive to the different solutions. For example, in Burkina Faso case, there was 2 years ago, we decided to call all the 3 operators and to negotiate before the end of the former licenses, new neutral technology licenses. And this process was not a classical process, but in the meantime, we succeed to achieve the big question of neutral technology, to achieve the question of securization. Now the license duration evolved from 10 to 15 years, and also we make a strong decision to share the spectrum that we were skipping. There is 10 years ago for eventually a fourth operator. We decided to share it between the existing one for two reasons. The first one is to give more spectrum by operators in order to improve quality. Then I noticed that I'm not far of the end of the time allowed. And what is very important for me to say is that there's no, for efficiency, specific solution that are adapted, but there is a solution which are well adapted to the real needs of the country. Then this is my first contribution to this panel, and I thank you all, and I'm present also for the next step of the session. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Galiam. Well, I think it's better now. We are ready here at the studio now. Yes, we will like to hear some consideration coming from GSMA. Kamal, are you ready?
Yes, thank you very much, Jean-Jacques. I thought the order was a little bit different, but I'm happy to go since you've called on me. And once again, good afternoon to everyone, and I suppose good morning if you're in that part of the world at the moment. I had some slides to present, if they could be put up, so that they can guide some of the comments that I'll be making. But it's a pleasure for me to be here participating in this conversation that will help us, discuss this very important issue around how to bring spectrum that is required to the market in order to help in evolving the shape of the spectrum landscape in Africa. Next slide, please. So maybe to guide the conversation, and perhaps it's always good to see, where we are at and where we're aiming to go. So looking at the impact that mobile broadband has on the economic fabric of the region, as at the end of 2019, we had 477 million connections, and we're anticipating that by 2025, we'll be hitting somewhere around 614 million unique mobile subscribers. So that will result, or the equivalent of about a 50% penetration rate. So 50%, about 50% of the population of the continent will be connected to a mobile broadband network of some sort. In terms of, a mobile network of some sort. In terms of mobile internet usage, as at the end of 2019, we were sitting just over 270 million, which was the equivalent of about 25-26% of the population of the region. And by 2025, we're anticipating that we should be seeing about 475 million unique mobile internet users, which will be equivalent of about 40% of the population. In terms of the kind of connections that we're seeing as well, from a mobile broadband perspective, specifically looking at 4G, as at the end of 2019, with the technology that's been deployed, about 9% of all network deployments was providing 4G services. And by 2025, we're aiming to be somewhere around the 30% rate in terms of network deployments. 5G will start off a little bit slower, so by 2025, we'll be seeing somewhere in the 3% range. So what all of this network deployment and investment is going to fuel is greater adoption as well. And we'll be seeing a lot more smartphones basically being used to connect to networks. So where we had only about 44% of the devices in the region as of 2019 being smart devices, by 2025, we anticipate that we'll be seeing about 65% of those. And overall, what all of this, in terms of the unique subscribers, the mobile internet usage, the deployment of the networks and also the adoption and the people actually using the services, what that is going to result in is about a 184 billion US dollars of contribution to the GDP of the region. That's where we are aiming to be, from contributing only about 155 billion US dollars in 2019. So it's basically about looking at where we are at and where we want to be. If we look at the next slide now, we start looking at some of the elements that will help to contribute to where we want to be. But just before then, at least looking at the level of coverage and the usage across the continent, you will see that as at the end of 2019, once again, at least 77% of the region was covered by a mobile broadband network. So 77% of the population was within reach of at least a 3G or a 4G network. And in that coverage, you'll find that actually there's only 28% of that population is actually using the services that are being provided. The coverage gap in itself is 23%. So only 23% or 300 million of the population in the region is not covered by a mobile broadband network. Now you may think, I mean, so with 77%, almost hitting 80%, we're doing really well. But then when you compare that to the rest of the world and look at what's happening in the developing world, globally as well, if you look at the global average, and especially when you compare to the developed world, you will see that actually 23% is quite high. Where we have only a 5% coverage gap in developing markets, 4% global average, and just only 1% in the developed world. If we go on to the next slide, in terms of the amount of spectrum that's been assigned, I think if you were fortunate enough to join the showcase session that just finished before this one, we did present highlights from this report that we did, where we looked at the impact of spectrum pricing across the region. And from that report and the analysis that we did, you compare the amount of spectrum that was assigned, that has been assigned as at the end of 2019 in Africa, and you will see that it's only about half of the global average. Not even comparing to what's happening, for instance, in the developed world. But then when you compare as well, even with developing markets similar to Africa, you will still find that operators in Africa are still assigned just about 80 megahertz on the average, where in other developing markets, you find that they have at least 100. So Africa still remains well behind, and there's a huge gap to fill in terms of the amount of spectrum that's been assigned. If you go on to the next slide, so looking at some of the elements that have an impact on how we can bridge that assignment gap, we have to start thinking about what we include in terms of the licensing terms that are associated with spectrum awards. What are the sort of payment terms that are included? How long are the spectrum licenses? These are some of the elements that we need to revise and revisit in terms of us being able to bridge that assignment gap. Spectrum pricing and the fees that are associated with using spectrum. These are very, very critical elements to the efficient utilization of spectrum that's been assigned, as well as also go a long way in terms of the decision making that helps in getting access to the spectrum from a private investor's perspective. So these are elements that we have to be very, very careful about when we think about the decisions that we make around them. Rollout and coverage obligations. There's always going to be a need, obviously, to see that every single individual in the country is covered by either a mobile network or a mobile broadband network. But at the end of the day, we also have to strike a balance as to how these obligations are also included in licenses. License duration I already mentioned earlier. It's very key for us to think about the terms of the licenses. Are they attractive enough for private investors to consider when thinking about getting access to spectrum? Are they long enough for them to be able to justify the investment in terms of gaining access to those spectrum bands? And then also, obviously, the conversations that are going to continue to happen at every WRC, in terms of seeking new additional spectrum that will help to fuel the deployment of mobile broadband services. So all of these elements, and quite a number more, I've just managed to pick a couple here, and I'm sure in the sessions we'll discuss a lot more of these. But suffice to say that I think these are some of the very key elements that need to be discussed and need to be carefully assessed when we think about how to meet the growing needs in terms of our coverage and capacity expectations in the region. I'll be happy to take any questions, and I'm looking forward to participating in the panel discussion going forward. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Kamal, for your. I think, yes, we will come back on some questions after all the set of presentations. May I now offer Richard from ICASA. Mr. Mablotto, are you with us? Can you please?
Oh, yes.
Yes, I know that, okay, you have prepared some good food for us. And of course, you are going to speak about the traffic forecast and some licensing considerations. So please make your presentation before we move forward.
Yes, yeah. Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, and thanks for the opportunity to present at this conference. And good afternoon, colleagues. Good morning, wherever you are. My name is Richard McParker from ICASA. We can go to the next slide. Just to indicate that next slide, please. Yeah, just the next one. It is our view that mobile telecommunication form a critical component to enable mechanism geared towards the achieving of the goal for broadband for all citizens in South Africa. It is therefore also important to note that the identification of the release of spectrum for IMT is one of the 7 key focus areas that is geared towards stimulating the investment in the country and also to revive the economy in the short and medium term, and to a certain extent to the long term as well. And therefore, in South Africa, we've experienced quite a growth in demand for IMT as a result of the traffic, the increase in traffic over the past few years. And currently, in South Africa, only about 609 megahertz of high demand spectrum has been licensed at the moment, and more is currently in the process of being assigned in order to stimulate this economy and also attract investment as well. Next slide, please. Yes, yeah. So we've looked at we've done a traffic forecast over the past few years in order to be able to assess the requirements, and we've realized that since 2011, traffic has increased almost 80 times through to 2020, and therefore this traffic requires more spectrum to be for us to be able to for the network operators to be able to operate efficiently, and therefore hence the release of the spectrum at the moment. South Africa is currently in the process of releasing more spectrum in order to meet these traffic demands. Next slide, please. Yes, yeah. So with regards to the licensing models and the licensing mechanism, since it is very important to actually plan ahead with regards to the type of service that will be a license, and as to whether the channel arrangements will be FDD and or TDD. But what we've realized is that the low frequency bands in the main focuses more on FDD arrangements, and TDD is the one that has more spectrum efficiency, and the medium bands and the high bands are very key in making sure that TDD is used to ensure that systems are synchronized and operate efficiently. It has quite a number of advantages because it provides more capacity and it increases efficiency as well. And it's also it has an advantage of dealing with traffic asymmetry, and it also enables network operators to operate together on a side by side seamlessly using synchronization. Therefore, TDD is the preferred method currently for the current spectrum assignment plans that we have going forward. Next slide, please. Yeah, so it is when we look at the issue around synchronization versus asynchronization, we've realized that the synchronization of TD systems globally, the ecosystem is fairly quite matured, and it's also to develop these receivers for the bands. It's also cheaper, and the frame structure is also fairly robust. Whereas with asynchronized systems, which is FDD, it tends to be fairly expensive, and therefore it becomes more inefficient for the deployment. Next slide, please. Yes. So what we've done is to look at the previous regimes. Historically, the assignment was done on a first-come, first basis, and therefore, in that case, Spectrum, in the end, laid fallow, in the sense that those operators who actually received Spectrum on a first-come, first basis tend to not see the need to deploy at a faster rate. Whereas once we introduce the competitive process, we've realized that the operators tend to actually maximize the benefits, because they've done more they've invested more in terms of acquiring the spectrum, and therefore they tend to compete, and therefore with competition, with that competition, it actually stimulates economic development, and therefore we look at the three methods of competitive process. That is the beauty contest, and also the hybrid arrangement, and also the auction process, auction method, and preferably the auction method is the more preferred method, in the sense that it is not subject to litigation. It is more open and fair process that we undertake. The next slide, please. Yes, so what we have currently, we have quite a number of some spectrum that's currently available, but we were envisaging that by 2020 we'd have between 1011 and 1036 megahertz of spectrum in order to be able to achieve the broadband connectivity requirements that are currently in the National Development Plan, which is the Vision 2020. And therefore, the intention was by 2020, we should have released at least 1,036 megahertz of spectrum, and it is currently underway. That process is currently underway. If we go to the next slide, since we only have 1 minute. So what we've just mapped up the process that needs to be followed as an example in order to be able to develop a long-term roadmap. That roadmap that is to lead towards the finalization of the auction process. So it is important for regulators to consider developing a long-term roadmap that considers coverage, capacity, and the capabilities of IMT 2020 in that regard, with proper spectrum plans. And once we have proper spectrum plans, and with time, exact time and duration of assignment, that is very important to make sure that in the end, the operators can get enough spectrum that is enough for coverage, capacity, and capabilities of the IMT 2020. So therefore, the deployment of 5G systems will be enhanced and expedited if we come up with long-term plans. And with the last slide, we also working on the long-term spectrum outlook, where we look at between 5 and 10 years of spectrum outlook, so that long-term planning can give operators certainty in terms of the future of spectrum access in the country. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Richard. I think, yes, you are already facilitating my task, because you are, of course, in your presentation, making already the pro and cons between TDD and FDD. But of course, we'll come back during the debate if some questions can be raised in the chat. We'll go to the next presentation before we launch discussions. So George William is coming from UCC in Uganda, a regulator from Uganda, and in charge of planning. So George, what is the status of the spectrum in Africa widely, and all these award techniques and models are there giving, in one sense, to make a decision to use the spectrum for the final user, the manufacturer, or to lose it? You have the floor for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Jacques. Thank you, the organizers, Forum Global. And then I want also to thank my organization, Uganda Communications Commission, for giving me the opportunity to represent it to this wonderful forum. A lot has been deliberated over the past couple of days. And I must say, Africa is speaking with a common language, speaking with one voice, in regard to spectrum management, where we are now and where we want to go, and what we envisage the sectors to reap benefits towards the consumer. Next slide, please. When we're looking at the evolving landscape of spectrum in Africa, by discussion we'll flash over 6 areas as highlighted on this slide. Next slide, please. The status of spectrum in Africa. Many of my colleagues have highlighted that we have 80% of mobile spectrum assigned, and we are lagging by 30%. And on a global view, Africa has assigned half of the spectrum that other developed countries, or globally, Africa is still lagging. But the good news about that is, when you look at the trends over the years from, say, around 2010, you see that Africa is steadily catching up, and this was very much evidenced at the recently concluded WRC 19. So from the status compiled by GSMA 2019, by the end of 2019, you'll see that Africa is slowly coming up. Next slide, please. So in that, it gives me confidence that the landscape is changing gradually, but in a positive direction. Now, we are all faced with the question of whether the current spectrum can address the growing coverage and capacity needs. Now, to me, spectrum being a natural resource, and in Uganda's perspective, it is a natural resource that has to be managed carefully. It cannot be enough, nor can it be depleted in a circumstance that there is still room for us to try and get more spectrum. But the whole essence should be how far or how better have we utilized what we have. We have the lower frequencies in the 700, say, for instance, in Uganda, we are now planning to open up the 700 for commercial use. The 800 is already licensed, the 900 and the 1800 as well. When we go to the medium frequencies, we are doing quite well. 21 is already in use. We have gone down to review the ranges between 2300 to 3400, and we think we will be getting out there to inform the stakeholders what our plans are for these bands. But for us to be able to address the coverage and the capacity needs, we need to look at other avenues, which I would call the multi-carrier connectivity, other avenues, opportunities that include the TV white spaces, Wi-Fi offloading, Wi-Fi onloading, and then also license shared access. We have gone ahead to review our licensing regime to accommodate regionalize the license in the bid to try and see that all the spectrum we have in this sub 6 gigahertz bands is well utilized, and services or communication services are extended to the entire coverage of Uganda, the territorial coverage of Uganda. Next slide, please. Well, in Uganda, in order to license spectrum, there are very many methodologies or techniques that can be used, but we are largely depending on or utilizing the administrative. Not that these other ones are like auctioning or lottery are not on the table for consideration, but depending on our national interest and national goals, objectives, and looking at the demand that we have for that particular spectrum that is on the table, we choose appropriately which direction to take, and largely administrative, in much as it is time consuming. There's a lot of back and forth, but at the end of the day, looking at our national objective, it gives us the comfort to be able to avail the spectrum for use. First come, first serve is also something that is well considered. Again, also depending on the demand we have for that spectrum. Next slide, please. Spectrum needs. Mobile has witnessed a growing need. Mobile has witnessed a growing need over other services, but this does not mean that the other services are not considered. In Uganda, what we have done is to go technology neutral, in that if a band can support more than one service, then we'll make sure that that service is well accommodated, and then licensing is considered, or licensing is done for whichever service requires access to that spectrum. So technology neutrality or service neutrality is key in addressing the mobile service needs versus the other services. Now, we have had before several spectrum bands going, or assignments going unutilized, which would be the following of spectrum. And for us to be able to avert that, we have taken several steps in trying to see that we have all that spectrum utilized, because spectrum that is lying idle does not benefit the community, and yet the intention of the regulator, Uganda Communications Commission, is to make sure that services reach to all Ugandans. And in Africa, I would say all African regulators have the same aspiration, that communication is reached to everyone, and then that digital divide or communication service divide is bridged up. Next slide, please. Spectrum is very valuable, very, very valuable. So if it is not utilized appropriately and exactly the time it is needed, then someone will stand to lose the access right to that spectrum. So there's a principle of use it or lose it, which has been adopted by very many administrations around the world. The EU has done that. In West Africa, we have 10 out of 15 administrations that have adopted it. And other African countries have, though they have used a different language to implement it. If you cannot absorb the spectrum that you have acquired for provision of services, then it is as good as returning it to the regulator so that someone capable can take it up and utilize it for the benefit or the economic growth of the country, the benefit of everyone else. So spectrum remains critical to the economic development of Africa, economic development of Uganda, because our fixed line penetration or fixed wireless access penetration is still low. So we rely largely on mobile services. As such, mobile spectrum has to be managed efficiently to ensure that we get the best out of it and the societies benefit the most out of it. Thank you very much, moderator. That is the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, George. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think we are at the end of which were to be and as I was anticipating. And our origin. So may I first look in the chat? After all, the very interactive ways with the public here. I see that in the chat you have only one question coming. So let me first start with the representative of the Ministry of Digital Economy of Burkina Faso. You are the policy maker. So do you think, yes, what you hear from the regulators, from ICASA and from UCC in Uganda, and the position of the GSMA, which is the association of all the operators and the industry, do you think that use it or lose it policy to increase the of the spectrum? Do you think it as stated by George? What kind of strike balance between the ever-increasing spectrum needs of mobile and those of other users? Because the trends in all these conferences is that, okay, people need more spectrum. This is the trend. Yes, but now, in the other hand, we heard that, okay, the spectrum is there, but it's not used. Inadequate use of the spectrum, which have been licensed. So do you think, how can we be ensured that spectrum is available for immediately, depending the three methods presented, multi contest, auctions, or direct allocation with pricing, but the trend is that, okay, a lot of spectrum is not used. And so from a policymaker view, what are your concern on those issues? Galiam, please, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Jean-Jacques, for those two questions. It's a very interesting. For the use it or lose it policy one, it's a very important and simply answer. This is effectively, essentially a regulatory question, and it's very important to give the power to regulators to be able to control and to manage the non-usage of spectrum. And generally, many of the regulations do not include this fact. And the trends, as said by George, all over the world is to include it, especially in Burkina Faso also we see it. But what is important to say is that generally the spectrum used by mobile operators is not so generally used, because most of the time it's not sufficient, but it's used. The main issue is with ISPs, which use the fixed service. Some of them was a former ISPs. They have spectrum, and at the time the regulation was not adapted to the use it or lose it. But I think for sure this is something that needs to be addressed, and including Burkina, I think this is for more efficiency is very important to manage that. And also, it's not also only the fixed service, even the former MMDS service, which was used for TV. Many of them use a lot of spectrum, especially in the 2.6, and it's not today with the evolution of broadband is not so important. Then absolutely, I think this is a regulatory question, and it's very important to improve efficiency. The second question was related to users of speech and coexistence with other services. I think that the best approach is to define priority, taking in consideration the own situation of the country. As I used to say, we should not follow spectrum and technology as a trend. We should adapt it to our reality. For example, when you see the example of European countries for the digital, for the broadcasting, they're using a lot of broadband solutions, and we do not have it. We have digital TV that we move on it. There is 5 years ago for most of the countries. Then it's very important to preserve the spectrum of digital TV. It's also important to secure the mobile usage, because as you know, in most of our country we use mobile solutions, for access capacity and the new usage. He was talking about the 700 bands, which is not very used. And what I suggest, and I think is very important, is to address the opportunities of a fixed service solution above 6 gigs. You know, with the 5G and most of the spectrum, I see the good example mentioned by George. It's very important to push to encourage the usage of this spectrum. Okay, and I think that what is also important is that in the regulation, we define the usage of a fund, a specific fund for the spectrum reorganization, because you know our world is very dynamic, and we should be very proactive. And in Burkina regulation, we have a specific fund for those evolution, which are adapted to the national politic and the national strategy for this point. Thank you, Jean-Jacques. And this is my answer to the two questions. Thanks. Hello, Jean-Jacques, do you hear me?
Thank you very much, Dalian.
Oh.
Yes, some questions in the chat. Leave them. I'm not sure my connection is better now, but even when I cut my camera, and I'm not sure that there is no micro cuts in video. Kamal, please. You have a wide perspective to compare the countries, and one question: there's some lack of planning, and Richard was speaking of long-term roadmap, long-term planning, and so on. This can explain why Burkina Faso was saying that, okay, it seems that, okay, the monitoring tools are not there, and we need the solutions adapted to the needs of our individual countries. So this said, what national broadband plans and roadmaps for spectrum release are being seen across the nations, and what impact can regulatory certainty in this way help to encourage the long-term investment? Because there's also a big problem of investing, and private entities are invested in the spectrum, but they want long-term investment. So how do you see that in your publications and analysis by GSMA of the global situation in sub-Saharan Africa? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jean-Jacques. That's a loaded question. But I think the benefits of roadmap really cannot be overstated. I mean, Richard has pointed it out, and I think Galiam has also mentioned it. Unfortunately, in sub-Saharan Africa itself, we don't see that many of them. I think South Africa is a fairly good example of where there actually is some effort that has been put into drafting and developing a spectrum roadmap. And obviously, I think Richard has also updated us with the fact that they're actually even looking to update that even further with a 5 to 10 year outlook. And more of that needs to be seen across the region. Quite a number of countries do have national broadband plans, and many times within those national broadband plans or national digital strategies, you find that there is an element of spectrum that is included in those plans. But those inclusions can actually be taken out and expanded a lot more. And with a dedicated spectrum roadmap being drafted and developed, it very clearly indicates to private investors what government's intention is with the availability of spectrum. This entire industry is popularly said, spectrum is the lifeblood of the industry. So with private investors getting a very good view of what government's thinking is for the next 5 to 10 years in terms of what spectrum bands are going to be made available, when they are going to be made available, how they're going to be made available, it helps in planning. Funds are not as easily accessible as they used to back in the day when many of the markets in the region got liberalized. These days, it's a lot harder to get those funds. It's a lot harder to justify investments. And with these sorts of plans, roadmaps in place, it clearly indicates to investors that governments are making arrangements for spectrum to be made available. And with that in mind, it makes it easier for them to facilitate access to funds that they will need to invest into deployment of networks that will fill the mobile broadband demand, the huge mobile broadband demand that, again, I think was highlighted in Richard's presentation. So absolutely, I think those roadmaps are very, very key, and we do continue to encourage many governments to continue to look into drafting out those plans and putting them in place.
So thank you. There's a question addressed to you, Kamal, in the chat, in trying to make a comparison between Europe and Africa situation regarding the market size. So can you give a few on that, please?
Yes. So the intention of that chat basically was to sort of not necessarily compare apples and apples, but basically just to set out the trend and see, where Africa is at in terms in relation to the rest of the world. And like we pointed out, it was clear to see that at the moment, Africa has assigned just about half of what is available as a global average. And this was not the case back in 2010. Around 2010, the entire world, including Africa, had assigned about the same amount of spectrum. But then over the past 10 years, and I think it was in one of the charts that was presented by George, you could basically clearly see Africa going almost towards a straight line, but then the rest of the world was going that way in terms of the amount of spectrum that was assigned. There is a huge catch-up that needs to be played in terms of filling that gap. And the reason why that gap needs to be filled is because the amount of spectrum that we currently have assigned is insufficient to meet the level of experience that we want to have from mobile broadband. We have seen from all of the studies that we've done that the amount of spectrum has a huge impact on the level of coverage that there is in a country. There is no understating the fact that where you see countries have assigned a lot more spectrum, you can find coverage levels with differences of up to about 20%, depending on the market. Where markets have assigned less spectrum, compared to markets where there's more spectrum that's been assigned, there's up to a 20% difference in terms of the level of coverage that's been provided. In terms of the speeds of the networks that are deployed as well, in markets where there's more spectrum assigned, there's almost a 5, 6, 7% difference in terms of the speeds that are available from the networks. Same thing comes to the adoption as well. Because the level of coverage means that people have a network to get access to, and then the speeds that you're getting, the higher they are, the better the experience with the mobile broadband. This means that there is more innovation, more kind of services can be built on those networks, and all of that helps to stimulate a lot more demand. So in markets where you see that a lot more spectrum is assigned, you find that, again, in terms of the usage gap, you'll see that there's almost a 20% difference between markets that have assigned more spectrum and markets that have assigned less spectrum. So that comparison is not necessarily to say that we focus on catching up, we specifically focus on catching up with Europe in terms of the spectrum assignment, but really is to focus on the benefits of actually assigning spectrum in those large amounts to the extent that the rest of the world has, so that we can actually have all of that feed into the socioeconomic benefits that come with access to greater amounts of spectrum.
Thank you, Kamal. Yes, I saw also a question in the chat coming from Boubakari Souley from TRB. Yes, do you think, George, you have been speaking of auctions and so on. The participant is asking if you would recommend using auctions for other frequency bands than the IMT. For the FM band, for example, the sound broadcasting, which is saturated, despite now that we are now trying to see how to digitalize these also. What are your thoughts? Is there some extension possible out of IMT bands and broadband mobile needs, and to try to use auctions in other band of frequencies?
Thank you, Jean-Jacques. Auction has been largely used for mobile spectrum because mobile spectrum's social value or social benefit spreads across the entire territorial coverage of whatever country is considering it, as opposed to, say, the FM or the other services. But then again, it is not ruled out. But the issue here is what is the demand for that spectrum in that country. In as much as, say, FM has high demand, it is it covers, for instance, if we looked at one channel, it will cover a small portion of the population, as opposed to when you say assign 5 megahertz of mobile spectrum to an operator who will extend or avail services to a big proportion of the population of that country. So you have to consider the demand. You have to consider the national objectives in respect to that spectrum. If the national objectives of that particular country are well set out, and then if you realize that the demand for that spectrum is high and the social benefit associated with that spectrum is really tangible and substantial, then you can't delve in it. But you have to bear in mind that running an auction is quite a complex issue or a complex activity, and it is quite very expensive. So you look at the proposal or the value proposition in respect to that spectrum, and the value proposition in respect to what the country wants to achieve utilizing that spectrum. So if you look at the FM or the VHF frequencies, subjecting them to an auction might be quite detrimental to a national economic and social benefit, as opposed to when you subject it to the mobile spectrum, because then the benefit realized out of it could be much greater, and then you'll be able to run the auction as of when you look at say the FM or the other bands. So it's a national issue, but then you have to take into account the principles of running an auction against the value you're going to get out of that spectrum. And if you're ready, you can give it a try. But I have not seen where, say, FM spectrum, that is the VHF 87.5 to 108, has been auctioned. It's more mobile because of the value associated to the mobile spectrum and because of the complexity and the expense of running an auction. Thank you.
Thanks, George. Yes, as we all know, the key challenge for regulators, not only in Africa, but also in the other parts of the world, is to identify first and release available spectrum bands and to bring them to the market. So let us come back to bringing the required spectrum to the market. And after your presentations, I think, yes, how we are speaking of the spectrum neutrality. So how important is the spectrum neutrality, and to what extent can bands such as the 2.6 gigahertz and the 2.3 evolve to support the 5G use, mainly in South Africa, as you have a good experience on the use of and planification of 5G systems there. So if Richard, you can maybe make the point of that.
And John Jack, Richard has actually dropped out. So Richard's dropped out, unfortunately. So we're trying to get him back.
Richard is no more connected?
No, he's dropped out at the moment, so we're trying to get him back.
So let us speak of the spectrum neutrality. It comes permanently in your presentations. So what is the advantage in terms of operators on this spectrum neutrality? I have lost Richard. I don't see him.
So, guys, I don't know if everyone John Jack said then. Basically, I think he was asking about the importance of spectrum neutrality, and I think raised the bands 2.3 and 2.6, and talking about what role they could play potentially moving forward to support 5G use. So, I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that at all.
Yeah, I'm happy to share a view. I think again, technology neutrality it really goes without saying that all of the licenses that we issue today in 2021, should be technology neutral. I think some of the first interactions that we had with the concept itself of technology neutrality came out of Europe, when obviously the first couple of GSM licenses were issued back in '86 or in the '80s. And I think by 2003, we saw the first 3G network being launched. And the 2.1 gigahertz band was specifically specified for 3G. But then there was a purpose behind that. The purpose was basically so that there would be uniformity in terms of the spectrum bands that was being used, and also the technology that was going to be used to deploy the broadband networks, so that would help to stimulate greater investments and greater deployments. Now, by 2007, when Europe realized they had reached up to about 100% in terms of mobile penetration, they realized there was no longer really a need to be very restrictive in terms of the spectrum bands that are associated with a particular technology. And by 2009, they had decided, maybe we could also use other bands for some of these broadband technologies, and that's when they took the decision to harmonize 900 and 1800, and also proposed new bands for 3G and other technologies. So it basically says to us that there might be a time where being technology specific could have been useful. You might have had some specific goals in terms of trying to aid, perhaps maybe network deployment or the ease of network deployment, and basically just to get people to access any basic sort of communication services. But really, that was in the early 2000s. We are now in 2021. Everybody's trying to get access to mobile broadband networks and the rich experiences that come from 4G and 5G networks. And so those technology-specific licenses are restricting service providers from being able to deliver on the demand from their customers and also from the citizens in terms of what they need. We've seen some in places where there's been an impact of some of the changes in this sort of thinking. I think back in 2017 or so, I think I shared a slide earlier on in terms of the coverage and usage gap, where I showed that there was about 77% coverage. Back in 2017, that was just about 63%. But then in 2018, we saw an increase in terms of the coverage levels that were being provided in the region by about 3 or 4% or so. And in the analysis that we did, we realized that one of the contributing factors to that was something that happened in Ghana. Ghana issues technology-specific licenses, but in that time, they sort of relaxed the conditions around using the 900 megahertz band in particular for rural areas. And with that, there was greater adoption of 3G services. So they allowed operators to be able to deploy U300, U900 with that spectrum band. And that also helped to stimulate greater coverage and greater adoption. So we've seen, the benefits of having technology neutral licenses is absolutely clear. And we have Richard back, maybe he might add some additional comments around, but just to say that I think it goes without saying really that in 2021, we really should be thinking, that technology specific licenses are old school, and we would want to move forward with modern day licensing in terms of technology neutrality.
So I don't know if Jean-Jacques is...
Thanks, Richard was back, but I think he's always facing some connectivity issues like me with the audio. Dan, do you hear me? Is the studio?
We can hear you.
You can hear me, okay. So thanks, Kemal. Yes, there's some trends in the plans of some countries, yes, to see how they could use, yes, the 2.3 gigahertz and the 2.6 gigahertz bands to try to support the 5G deployment. But this is another issue, and I think for those who follow up the WRC 23 agenda items, yes, there is still some compatibility studies to be done and some other things we need to discuss in order to see how we will use those respective bands. Burkina Faso has tried several type of license. So what is the trend in planning the 5G ecosystem in Burkina Faso, Galiam? Do you think that, okay, you will use the auctions, which seems to be transparent and fair, or try to see the demand size, and after see if a beauty contest or some education can be made with a specific melting pot of all these methods. Galiam, please.
Okay, thank you, Jean-Jacques. Alors, in Burkina Faso, for the moment, we do not have a real strategy dedicated to 5G and IMT 2020. What we have is a national plan, a global plan for the 10 next years to improve the broadband. In this plan, as you know, the country have many issues of connectivity. We are an interland country and the backbone. On the last 5 years, we work a lot on those topics. But for sure, the spectrum is very important. Is addressed by the private sector. Then we give the neutral technological licenses, and we are preparing now. Our vision is that we do not follow the 5G as a trend, but as a part of a national strategy. Then we're preparing a plan of development. I hope it will be ready for beginning of next year. And this plan we know in the 5G is no more a vertical market but a horizontal market. When we are working with all the sector of digital transformation in order to address agriculture, mining, all the 5G potential on those areas before to go to a real strategy. For us, the vision is not to go to launch a frequency just to have a mobile 5G because it's present in some other countries, but is to have a real strategy about 5G. You know, in the 5G, you should not see it only with the enhanced broadband issue. It's a massive machine telecommunication type. It's a lot of applications. For us, if we succeed to acquire a good strategy about it, we are working on it because we hope to have the result of the work on this one beginning of next year, and after that, all the plan will be managed. Then this is our vision in Burkina Faso, according to the 5G, not to follow the trend, but have a real strategy before to go. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Galiam. Very good. There are some questions in the chat. I will recommend Kamal, yes, to answer them directly to Renner, which has some specific issue to discuss with you on some considerations in urban and rural areas. But mainly, gentlemen, we have 5 minutes left. And of course, if I can capture around your presentations, what was coming on the table is that, okay, it seems that, okay, there's a lack of information on the real use of the spectrum in most of the sub-Saharan countries. Is it a lack of tools? Is it a lack of monitoring? This we have to go deeper to see. And of course, the solution should be adapted to the needs of the countries in mainly trying to build upon attractive licenses, attractive regimes, attractive ways to have the spectrum adequately used. Now, of course, the regulation will support the greater efficiency in the spectrum usage, but these led on 5 pillars, as stated by Kamal. And mainly, if licensing is there and so on, you have also to study the market and to see how the industry can benefit of the predictability of the assignation of this spectrum. There's a big gap between the mobile broadband coverage and the usage, as stated by GSMA reporting and so on. And of course, we should try to do our best to reduce and to bridge this gap in order to benefit of the income generated by the spectrum. Now, use it or lose it. Countries, yes, may. The spectrum not used is a loss. The revenue is a loss in our planning. So, of course, we should adequately see when the spectrum is not used, how to put it back on the table for the other to try to use it adequately. Now, We also heard that in terms of techniques, yes, synchronizations of IMT 2020, the new radio synchronizations tools are there, and you have to use them in order to improve the efficiency of your spectrum. And making an outlook review of the spectrum licensing, yes, there's a clear need of long-term planning, of establishing roadmaps in order for the operators, for the mobile industry, the broadband industry, to see how they can plan adequately the usage of those scarce resources. This is done, what I will say, by ending to give 30 seconds to each of the speakers to what will be your last word, what you bring back home from this Spectrum Forum of 2021, which was very difficult online, but which was made with a lot of sessions. So what's the carry out for you? In 30 seconds each, please.
Okay, I will go first, Jean-Jacques. Thank you very much. From the deliberations of fellow panelists and...
You can go, Kamal, first. Carry out, we'll go. Associations.
So sorry, guys. There seems to be a little bit of a delay, I think, with Jean-Jacques' audio, which is causing a few bits of confusion. So, George, please, you go first, George.
Oh, thank you. As I was saying that from the fellow panelists and comments and questions that have been posed to the panel and all the other sessions before this one, it is very evident that for my administration, we have covered some good mileage in terms of our spectrum management and ensuring that we bring spectrum to the sector, to the industry to use. But then again, we still have some more to do. And from this discussion, we realized that there are some critical issues around 5G that we have to pay attention to. What spectrum do we really need to look at, depending or focusing on our national interest? Because at the end of the day, spectrum is spectrum, but then the main point is, what are the national interests in regard to all the spectrum that you want to put on the table? We have a lot of work going on internally to try to address some of these issues. And again, with the collaboration of the ATU, which came up with several recommendations towards efficient management of spectrum, we realize that harmonization is very key. Technology neutrality is also another key aspect. We have already incorporated technology neutrality in our licensing. And then collaboration with other administrations, neighboring administrations or across Africa is also very important. And this forum has brought very many regulators, sector players, vendors and associations who have shared very valuable information that we have to tap into to ensure that the sector in Uganda is very vibrant. It addresses the common good of the nation, and it strives to bridge the digital divide, bringing communication services to everyone. I think that is what we take away from this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George, and some great final remarks there, so thank you very much. Gallium, maybe next I can turn to yourself, and same thing, if I could ask you to keep it quite brief. We are running out of time, but yeah, briefly your final remarks and things on that as well, Gallium. Thank you. Okay,
thank you, Dan. Thanks to all. I will go in few words, as George say many things: harmonization, technological neutrality, solution adapted to our needs, spectrum for our needs. Usage of available spectrum is very important, and take advantage of opportunities offered by IMT 2020. Thank you. That's my last words.
Thank you, Gallium. Perfect. And again, a great way to sum things up. So thank you very much. And Kamal, last words to yourself for your final conclusions from this session.
Thanks a lot, Dan. I mean, driving access to mobile broadband obviously is going to require quite a number of components that will help to make that possible. Spectrum is only one of those. And even in Spectrum itself, there are many other smaller decisions and many other components under there that, make Spectrum to be utilized for the best for the best possible outcomes in terms of access to mobile broadband. Service and technology neutrality is absolutely key. The amount of spectrum that we provide access to service providers for. Pricing, I think it wasn't mentioned too much on this particular session, but the pricing decisions that we make in terms of access to spectrum are absolutely key. Those rollout obligations, weigh in what we want to achieve with awarding spectrum, and making sure that spectrum is assigned to the extent that it also reaches those in unserved and underserved areas, and also the highest quality of networks are also provided to those citizens. There are many different components, and the more of these sorts of conversations we have, the closer we are going to get to being able to tick as many boxes as possible, such that we maximize the benefits of access to spectrum. It's not going to be ever going to be a one size fits all solution, and nobody knows it all. And it's very possible as well that in your decision making you could miss one or two if you're not completely aware of. So really, the more of these conversations we have and the more we share, the better we are in terms of the knowledge that we have for spectrum management, and the closer we are to making sure that our citizens get the maximum benefit from access to mobile broadband in Africa.
Kamal, perfect. A great way to finish things off. So thank you very much. And thank you all for a really interesting panel. Thank you as well to Jean-Jacques and Richard. Unfortunately, we did have a few technical issues with the connectivity there, but these things happen with the virtual event. But I hope you all agree, a fascinating panel, and I think it was some really, really interesting discussions. And as I've said on previous events, I'm sure some of these issues are definitely going to be discussed a lot more in future editions of the conference. So thank you all very much, and thank you to everyone out there for all your contributions to that session as well. Really appreciate it. Okay, so that basically runs things up. Sorry, that ends things off for the actual discussions and the debates at the conference this year. But we do now have our closing ceremony. So we're going to now be hearing from some key stakeholders on their key thoughts, their takeaways and conclusions from the event. So that's going to be here on the main stage in just about 30 seconds. So don't go anywhere. We'll be back very, very shortly with the closing ceremony. Thank you very much, everyone.